In the year 1177, a conflict unfolded that would etch itself into the annals of military history, not because of the scale of destruction or political upheaval, but because of the sheer improbability of the encounter. Imagine a force of merely 500 heavily armed and trained knights standing against an army of 26,000 warriors. The odds were astronomically against them, yet this confrontation became legendary, a story of audacity, tactical brilliance, and the limits of numerical advantage. To understand why this battle was so extraordinary, we must first examine the political, social, and military context that led to such a dramatic showdown. The late 12th century was a period of immense turmoil across Europe and the Near East. Feudal lords and kings jostled for territory and influence, while the concept of chivalry shaped the warrior class of knights. These knights were no ordinary soldiers, they were elite warriors, often drawn from noble families, trained from childhood in horseback riding, swordsmanship, and the art of war. Their armor alone, full chainmail or plate, with helmets, shields, and lances, made them formidable adversaries. In many ways, knights were the special forces of their era, able to inflict devastating damage on massed armies of less organized soldiers. The opposing force, numbering 26,000 men, was a heterogeneous collection of warriors. Such a large army in the 12th century was rarely composed entirely of professional soldiers. It included foot soldiers wielding spears, axes, or swords, archers capable of delivering volleys of deadly arrows, and a smaller contingent of cavalry, though far less disciplined and armored than the knights they faced. The scale of this army provided numerical dominance, but with size came logistical challenges. Feeding, coordinating, and maneuvering such a mass of men was an immense task. Even a minor mistake could lead to confusion, collapse, or disaster. The precise location of this confrontation was carefully chosen, either by design or necessity. Battles in the medieval period were often dictated as much by terrain as by strategy. Narrow passes, river crossings, hills, and forests could neutralize the advantages of a larger army, while open plains favored cavalry charges and massed formations. In this particular encounter, the terrain played an unusually critical role. Historical records suggest that the smaller force was able to exploit narrow defiles and choke points, forcing the larger army to funnel its numbers inefficiently, limiting its ability to bring overwhelming force to bear. This was a key factor that allowed a small, disciplined group of knights to challenge a seemingly unstoppable army. Leadership was another decisive factor setting the stage for this improbable battle. The commanders of the 500 knights were not only experienced warriors, but also brilliant tacticians. They understood the psychological impact of their presence on both their own troops and the enemy. Knights relied not merely on brute force, but on the careful orchestration of maneuvers, the timing of charges, and the intimidation factor inherent in their heavily armored appearance and mounted speed. On the other side, the leaders of the 26,000-strong army faced the enormous challenge of coordinating a vastly larger force, ensuring that orders were relayed and executed across miles of soldiers, many of whom may have been levied peasants with minimal training. The stage for the battle was also influenced by the political stakes. Large-scale conflicts in this period were rarely fought for purely personal reasons. They often reflected broader struggles for territory, feudal dominance, or control of strategic trade routes. The smaller army, while dwarfed in numbers, may have had more to lose and therefore fought with heightened intensity and unity. Conversely, the larger force, confident in its numerical advantage, may have underestimated the resolve and ingenuity of the knights, setting the stage for a shocking reversal of expectations. Beyond strategy and politics, the morale and psychology of the soldiers played a crucial role. In medieval warfare, morale could swing a battle dramatically. The sight of 500 armored knights charging at high speed was terrifying even to well-trained troops, especially if the larger army was spread out or poorly coordinated. The knight's reputation alone could induce panic, hesitation, or disorder among the enemy ranks. Conversely, the knights themselves, aware of their precarious position, were likely motivated by a combination of fear, pride, and honor, each factor sharpening their focus and determination. Historical accounts hint at a sense of inevitability surrounding this confrontation. Contemporary chroniclers often framed the battle as a clash of destiny, a small force standing against impossible odds, testing the limits of courage and military science. Such accounts, while sometimes romanticized, underscore the extraordinary nature of the event. Medieval warfare was full of skirmishes and sieges, but rarely did so few stand against so many and live to tell the tale. The battle became emblematic of the potential for strategy, discipline, and audacity to overturn the laws of arithmetic. Finally, the battle's timing and the larger strategic landscape magnified its significance. The year 1177 was marked by regional instability, shifting alliances, and ongoing power struggles. Any victory, particularly one as unlikely as this, had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield itself. It influenced future campaigns, bolstered the reputation of the victors, and provided lessons in military strategy that would be studied by generals for generations. The improbable clash between 500 knights and 26,000 warriors thus became a reference point for historians, a case study in how elite forces, clever tactics, and psychological leverage can dramatically offset numerical superiority. In conclusion, the stage for the 1177 battle was set not merely by numbers but by a convergence of geography, leadership, morale, and tactical ingenuity. The odds against the 500 knights were astronomical, yet each factor, the elite training of the knights, the challenges of commanding a massive army, the terrain, and the high stakes, created the conditions for an encounter that would defy logic and astonish historians. What unfolded was not simply a fight, but a dramatic confrontation that demonstrated how skill, courage, and strategy could rewrite expectations, leaving a legacy that echoes through military history to this day in the medieval world. Knights were far more than just soldiers. They were a fusion of elite military skill, social prestige, and disciplined professionalism. The 500 knights who stood against 26,000 warriors in 1177 represented the pinnacle of this warrior class. To understand how such a small force could even hope to challenge a vastly larger army, it is essential to examine who these knights were, how they trained, how they were equipped, and the psychological and tactical advantages they brought to the battlefield. From the moment of their youth, knights were groomed for warfare. Sons of noble families were sent to the courts of kings or senior lords, where their education began with horsemanship and physical conditioning. By the age of 7, they were pages, learning to ride, to fight, and to adhere to codes of conduct that emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor. By adolescence, they became squires, serving senior knights directly, learning not only the mechanics of combat, but also battlefield strategy, formation tactics, and the subtleties of commanding men under duress. The transition from squire to knight was formalized through ceremonies, often including oaths to protect the weak and fight with valor. By the time they were fully fledged knights, these men were not only physically formidable, but mentally trained to remain calm and decisive in chaos. The composition of the 500 knights in 1177 was critical to their potential effectiveness. Each knight typically wore a combination of chainmail and, for the more affluent, plate armor, providing both mobility and protection. Helmets with visors shielded their faces, while shields emblazoned with family heraldry served as both defense and a rallying symbol for comrades. Their primary weapons included the lance, ideal for the devastating shock of a mounted charge, and the longsword, perfect for close combat once the initial charge had disrupted enemy lines. Many knights also carried secondary weapons, such as daggers or maces, for versatility in battle. The combination of skill, armor, and weaponry allowed these men to deliver concentrated force at precise points, something an untrained mass of 26,000 warriors could struggle to withstand. But it was not just the equipment that gave these knights an edge, it was how they used it. Medieval warfare often relied heavily on cavalry charges to break enemy formations, but effective use required discipline and timing. The 500 knights in 1177 would have been organized into cohesive units, often led by experienced commanders who could read the battlefield and exploit weaknesses in enemy lines. Unlike a larger army, which could be slow to react and prone to disorganization, The knights were agile, capable of rapid advances, retreats, and flanking maneuvers. In essence, their value lay not in numbers, but in precision, coordination, and the psychological impact of a compact, elite force charging with deadly intent. Leadership within the knightly force was equally significant. Commanders were chosen not only for noble lineage, but for experience and tactical acumen. They had to maintain morale under seemingly impossible odds, coordinate attacks across difficult terrain, and adapt quickly to unexpected developments. In the chaos of a battle against overwhelming numbers, a single error could be fatal, but conversely, clever leadership could turn a small unit into an instrument of devastating efficiency. Historical records suggest that in encounters like the 1177 battle, these knights were capable of reading the enemy, anticipating movements, and executing complex maneuvers that could sow confusion among thousands of less disciplined soldiers. Psychology played a crucial role as well. The knight's presence alone could intimidate enemy forces. Mounted, heavily armored, and charging in disciplined formations, the knights appeared almost unstoppable to soldiers who had rarely faced such a concentrated display of martial prowess. The sight of 500 elite knights advancing at speed, lances leveled, banners waving, could cause panic, hesitation, and disarray in even well-trained regiments. This psychological leverage, often overlooked in modern analysis, was one of the knight's most potent weapons. Another key advantage was experience and versatility in different forms of combat. Knights were trained to fight both mounted and on foot, and they were accustomed to adapting to a wide range of scenarios, from open field clashes to narrow passes where maneuverability was restricted. In the 1177 battle, the knights' ability to exploit terrain, use choke points to neutralize the enemy's numerical superiority, and maintain formation under pressure was central to their survival and effectiveness. Each knight was not simply a fighter but a tactical unit in miniature, capable of acting autonomously while still contributing to the group's collective strength. Discipline was another defining feature of these elite warriors. Unlike levied troops or peasant conscripts who made up the bulk of medieval armies, knights were bound by strict codes and rigorous routines. They maintained order under fire, followed commands precisely, and coordinated movements that could turn the tide of battle. This discipline allowed a small contingent to punch above its weight, sustaining attacks, executing feigned retreats, or holding critical positions with efficiency that sheer numbers alone could not match. It is also important to consider the logistical and support systems that made the knights effective. Each knight often traveled with a retinue of squires and support personnel who managed horses, weapons, and supplies. These auxiliary forces ensured that knights remained combat-ready, well-fed, and mobile, capable of extended engagements that might exhaust less prepared adversaries. The effectiveness of a knight was thus not merely in personal skill but in the integrated system of support that enabled him to operate at peak performance. Finally, the unity and cohesion of the 500 knights cannot be overstated. This was a force that had trained together, fought together, and understood each other's tactics intimately. Such cohesion made them more than a collection of individual fighters. It made them a singular, coordinated instrument of war. Whereas the larger army of 26,000 faced difficulties of communication, coordination, and consistency, the knights could act with near-perfect synchronization, striking where the enemy was weakest and retreating when necessary, all while maintaining morale and focus. In summary, the 500 knights were elite warriors in every sense, physically formidable, highly trained, strategically disciplined, and psychologically imposing. They relied not on numbers but on precision, coordination, and an understanding of terrain and tactics that magnified their effectiveness. Their armor, weapons, leadership, and training transformed them into a force capable of challenging overwhelming odds, turning what should have been an impossible encounter into a historical testament to the power of elite military skill. Against an army of 26,000 warriors, their success would rely on every aspect of their preparation, every ounce of courage, and every decision made in the heat of battle. a delicate balance of skill, strategy, and sheer nerve that would define one of the most remarkable engagements of the medieval period. In any account of medieval warfare, numbers often appear decisive. An army of 26,000 warriors in 1177 represented a staggering force, capable of overwhelming most opponents simply by sheer volume. Yet, as history has repeatedly shown, size alone does not guarantee victory. To fully understand why this army, so vast in scale, ultimately struggled against a handful of elite knights, it is essential to examine its composition, organizational structure, strategies, and inherent vulnerabilities. The 26,000-strong force was far from uniform. Unlike the disciplined, heavily armored knights they faced, this army was composed of multiple tiers of warriors with varying levels of training, equipment, and battlefield experience. At its core were professional soldiers, perhaps veterans, foot soldiers and mounted knights of their own, who served as the backbone of the army. These men were better equipped and trained, capable of following orders and engaging in complex maneuvers. However, the majority of the force consisted of levied troops, drawn from peasants, local militias, or recently conscripted fighters. While their sheer numbers could overwhelm an unorganized enemy, their discipline, cohesion, and morale were often questionable, especially when confronted with elite adversaries or unconventional tactics. Foot soldiers formed the bulk of the army. Armed with spears, swords, axes, or improvised weapons, they were organized into formations designed to hold the line, absorb cavalry charges, or advance en masse against smaller enemy units. Archers provided ranged support, firing volleys that could disrupt enemy formations or force opponents to take cover. Cavalry units were present, but limited compared to the knights they faced, often composed of lesser nobles or mounted infantry rather than elite cavalry. While these units added mobility and striking power, coordinating them across the battlefield proved challenging. Command and communication in an army of 26,000 presented enormous difficulties. Orders had to travel through layers of sub-commanders, often across great distances and amid the chaos of combat. Signals, flags, horns, or messengers could be misinterpreted or delayed, and confusion could easily ripple through the ranks. In contrast, the 500 Croatian kunas operated as a highly cohesive unit, capable of responding rapidly to changing circumstances. The sheer size of the larger army, which might seem an advantage on paper, introduced a critical vulnerability. Coordination under pressure was far from guaranteed. Logistics were another enormous challenge. Feeding, supplying, and maneuvering 26,000 men required meticulous planning and constant attention. Armies of this size needed vast quantities of food, water, and equipment, and delays or shortages could weaken morale or force commanders into hasty decisions. Horses required fodder, weapons needed maintenance, and armor had to be functional for effective combat. In many medieval battles, logistical failures were as deadly as enemy action, and commanders of massive armies had to constantly balance the practicalities of supply with the demands of strategy. The psychology of such a large force was complex. Confidence in overwhelming numbers could easily tip into overconfidence. While the soldiers might initially feel assured of victory, the presence of elite knights or a well-executed ambush could quickly induce panic. Historical examples from this period demonstrate that mass troops often broke and fled if the initial charge was disrupted, if they encountered unexpected resistance, or if morale faltered. Unlike disciplined knights who thrived under pressure, large armies could crumble in the face of shock or confusion. Despite these vulnerabilities, the army's strengths were considerable. When properly coordinated, 26,000 men could dominate the battlefield. Their mass allowed for wide-ranging flanking maneuvers, enveloping attacks, and sustained pressure on key positions. They could form nearly unbreakable defensive lines, overwhelming smaller units with attrition. Archers could rain down arrows to weaken enemies before a decisive charge, and cavalry could exploit gaps created by infantry. Against poorly trained or fragmented forces, such a mass would be nearly unstoppable. The problem lay in executing these advantages effectively against a nimble, elite, and highly motivated opponent. Commanders of the massive army faced a delicate balance between aggression and control. Sending small detachments to scout, harass, or flank was risky because it spread forces thin. Concentrating the entire army for a single assault risked miscommunication, gaps in the lines, and logistical strain. Any miscalculation, misjudging terrain, underestimating the enemy, or mistiming an advance could prove catastrophic. In this sense, while the army had immense potential power, it required flawless execution to transform numbers into victory. Terrain played a decisive role in amplifying both the strengths and weaknesses of the larger force. In open plains, massed troops could move efficiently, coordinate cavalry and infantry, and maintain strong defensive positions. But in narrow passes, hills, or areas with natural choke points, such a massive army became vulnerable. Knights could exploit these constraints, attacking small segments of the army in concentrated strikes, while the rest of the force was unable to respond quickly. The very factor that gave the army its size advantage, its mass, could become a liability in constrained spaces. The army's cohesion depended not just on training, but on loyalty and morale. Large forces often included warriors from diverse regions, bound by temporary alliances or feudal obligations. Some soldiers might be reluctant participants, poorly motivated, or skeptical of their leader's competence. If elite knights or unexpected maneuvers disrupted the enemy's expectations, these soldiers could panic, hesitate, or desert. In medieval battles, morale was often the deciding factor, more so than weapons or numbers. An army of 26,000 that lacked unity or confidence could collapse under the pressure of 500 determined and coordinated knights. Finally, historical accounts suggest that the massive army's leadership may have underestimated the knights they faced. Overconfidence can be lethal. Assuming that sheer numbers guarantee victory often leads to tactical mistakes. While the army could theoretically envelop or crush the smaller force, doing so required precision, patience, and vigilance, qualities difficult to maintain in a large, diverse, and fatigued army. Any lapse in discipline or delay in orders could be exploited by the highly mobile, shock-oriented tactics of the knights. In conclusion, the 26,000-strong Army of 1077 represented the ultimate expression of medieval numerical power. It had enormous potential to dominate the battlefield, relying on massed formations, archery volleys, cavalry, and sheer attrition. Yet the very scale that gave it strength also introduced vulnerabilities, communication difficulties, logistical burdens, variable training, and the constant risk of panic under stress. When faced with a compact, elite, and coordinated force of 500 knights, these weaknesses could, and historically did, be exploited. The battle illustrates a timeless military principle: numbers matter, but strategy, discipline, leadership, and psychological factors often matter even more. The stage was set. The sun rose over the battlefield in 1177, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain, illuminating a scene that seemed almost surreal. 500 knights, gleaming in armor, mounted on powerful destriers, facing an army of 26,000 men that stretched across the horizon. On paper, the outcome appeared predetermined. Yet from the first clash, it became evident that this encounter would defy conventional military logic, demonstrating the extraordinary potential of elite forces, terrain mastery, and tactical ingenuity. The engagement began with cautious maneuvers. The larger army, confident in its overwhelming numbers, sought to envelop the knights and restrict their movement. Its commanders spread their forces wide, intending to use the sheer mass of men to crush any resistance. Archers were positioned to unleash volleys that could devastate a smaller force, while infantry formations bristled with spears and shields, ready to absorb the shock of cavalry. Cavalry units of the larger army were held in reserve, prepared to exploit gaps or flank the enemy once the infantry lines engaged. The knights, by contrast, moved with deliberate precision. Their commanders understood that reckless charges could lead to annihilation, given the numerical disadvantage. Instead, they used the terrain to their advantage. Hills, narrow passes, and natural choke points allowed the knights to limit the enemy's ability to bring their full strength to bear. By forcing the larger army into constrained areas, the knights neutralized the numerical advantage that might otherwise have been overwhelming. When the first clash occurred, it was both terrifying and extraordinary. The knights charged with lances leveled, their horses thundering across the field in perfect formation. The impact was devastating. Where a single knight might penetrate lightly trained infantry lines with difficulty, 500 moving as one created a shockwave that sent soldiers staggering, shields splintering, and morale cracking. The sheer weight and momentum of the charge caused chaos among the enemy ranks. Thousands of warriors, confident in their numbers, found themselves unable to respond coherently to a concentrated, precise strike. What followed was a battle of contrasts: mass versus skill, quantity versus quality, disorder versus discipline. The larger army attempted to recover by forming new lines, reasserting control over the scattered units, and deploying archers to break the momentum of the knights. Yet coordination was difficult. Messages from the commanders were delayed or misinterpreted, and the sheer scale of the army meant that while one flank held, another might already be crumbling. The knights, trained to exploit such vulnerabilities, struck again and again, alternating charges with tactical withdrawals, luring sections of the enemy into traps, and targeting weak points with unerring precision. One of the most remarkable aspects of the battle was the use of feigned retreats by the knights. In several instances, they appeared to fall back under pressure, drawing segments of the larger army into narrow defiles where the enemy's numbers became a liability. Trapped and compressed, these troops could be overwhelmed by concentrated strikes. The knights' combination of mobility and discipline allowed them to strike decisively, then reposition before being encircled or isolated themselves. It was a display of battlefield psychology. As much as brute force, the larger army reacted to perceived opportunities only to be manipulated into disadvantageous positions. Amid the chaos, leadership on both sides was crucial. The knights' commanders continuously assessed the battlefield, shifting forces to critical points, coordinating charges, and maintaining morale among their men. Orders were relayed quickly, and each knight understood his role within the larger formation. By contrast, the massive army's leaders faced constant challenges. Signals were misread, sub-commanders sometimes acted independently, and coordination faltered as units became separated. Even minor errors in communication could cascade into larger disruptions, leaving entire sections of the army exposed. Terrain played a further decisive role. Hills provided the knights with elevated vantage points, narrow valleys served as kill zones, and forests or rocky areas restricted the enemy's ability to maneuver. In one crucial maneuver, the knights funneled a detachment of several thousand enemy soldiers into a constricted area where their numbers became irrelevant. The knights could attack from multiple directions, exploiting confusion and preventing the enemy from forming effective defensive formations. The result was a sequence of local victories that, while small in scale compared to the total army size, had a disproportionate impact on morale and momentum. Another striking feature of the battle was the psychological impact on the larger army. While thousands of men might appear invincible, the sight of relentless, coordinated charges by heavily armored knights, the thunder of horses, and the devastating shock of concentrated lances created panic. Soldiers who had entered the battle with confidence now hesitated, faltered, or fled. Reports suggest that fear spread more quickly than orders, aiding to gaps in the lines and isolated pockets of resistance that the knights could exploit. In essence, the battle became a contest not merely of strength, but of nerve and psychological endurance. The use of combined arms, cavalry, infantry, and terrain, demonstrated the knights' tactical brilliance. They never relied on brute force alone. Each action was calculated to maximize impact and minimize exposure. For instance, archers accompanying the knights would target exposed enemy commanders, sowing additional confusion. Cavalry charges were timed to coincide with enemy missteps, and infantry support helped hold captured positions. This integrated approach allowed a tiny force to punch far above its weight, turning moments of opportunity into decisive outcomes. As the day wore on, the battle evolved into a series of brutal encounters across the field. The knights, though heavily outnumbered, maintained cohesion and adapted continuously. The massive army, while still formidable, was hampered by its own size and internal challenges. Despite repeated attempts to encircle or overwhelm the knights, their formations held, and tactical ingenuity allowed them to exploit mistakes in the enemy lines. By sunset, the battlefield bore the marks of extraordinary combat, pockets of resistance scattered, commanders reassessing their positions, and a small but elite force demonstrating that discipline, coordination, and audacity could defy logic itself. Ultimately, the clash of 1177 serves as a testament to the power of elite forces operating under brilliant leadership. The knights' ability to combine skill, discipline, and psychological warfare allowed them to neutralize the overwhelming numerical advantage of their opponents. Every charge, withdrawal, and maneuver demonstrated a mastery of battlefield dynamics rarely seen in medieval warfare, making this confrontation a defining moment in military history. In conclusion, the battle unfolded as a dramatic interplay of chaos and brilliance. The 500 knights leveraged terrain, coordination, and morale to strike decisively at vulnerable points, while the 26,000-strong army, despite its numerical might, struggled with communication, cohesion, and the psychological impact of facing elite opponents. It was a battle that defied conventional expectations, proving that strategy, training, and courage can outweigh even the most overwhelming odds. The events of that day would be remembered for centuries as one of the most astonishing demonstrations of tactical genius in medieval warfare. The dust of the battlefield settled, leaving a scene that seemed almost unreal. Against all expectations, a force of merely 500 knights had faced an army of 26,000 warriors and emerged not completely annihilated, with some accounts suggesting a tactical victory or at least a miraculous survival. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a mixture of chaos, strategic recalibration, and shock, both for the victors and the vanquished. While the scale of losses remains a matter of historical debate, the impact on the morale, politics, and military thinking of the time was profound. For the 500 knights, the aftermath brought both relief and renewed responsibility. These men, having faced overwhelming odds and survived, solidified their reputation as elite warriors of extraordinary skill and discipline. Chroniclers of the era often emphasized their courage, coordination, and tactical brilliance, transforming them into legendary figures whose exploits inspired fear and respect across Europe. Their survival and effectiveness in battle were a testament to the training, leadership, and cohesion that defined the medieval knightly class. Each knight returned to his lord or king not merely as a soldier, but as a symbol of audacity and martial excellence, capable of shaping the course of regional power struggles. The larger army, numbering 26,000, faced immediate challenges in the aftermath. Despite its size, the army had been unable to secure a decisive victory, a failure that shook morale and raised questions about leadership and organization. Commanders were forced to account for mistakes in coordination, miscommunication, and underestimation of the enemy. Entire units may have been scattered, some fleeing in panic during the battle, others rendered ineffective due to fatigue or confusion. Such experiences often led to internal recriminations, the reassessment of tactical doctrines, and in some cases, the replacement of leaders deemed incapable of managing large-scale forces effectively. Politically, the battle had far-reaching consequences. In the medieval period, military reputation was closely tied to authority and legitimacy. For the victorious knights, even in such small numbers, the ability to challenge and neutralize a vastly larger force enhanced their political capital. Lords and kings associated with the knights could leverage the victory to solidify alliances, deter rivals, and assert dominance in regional conflicts. Conversely, the failure of the larger army, despite its size, weakened the position of its commanders and sponsors. Allies might reconsider their support, and local populations could question the competence of rulers who could not effectively command overwhelming forces. Historians have long marveled at the tactical lessons of this improbable encounter. At its core, the battle demonstrates that numbers alone do not determine outcomes. Factors such as terrain, coordination, discipline, morale, and leadership often outweigh raw numerical superiority. The knight's ability to exploit choke points, execute feigned retreats, and maintain cohesion under pressure illustrates the enduring importance of strategy and adaptability in warfare. Conversely, the vulnerabilities exposed in the massive army highlight the limitations of size without effective command and control, a principle that resonates across military history, from medieval conflicts to modern battles. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Stories of 500 knights standing against 26,000 warriors circulated widely, shaping the perception of martial skill and elite forces for generations. For commanders across Europe, the battle became a case study in the value of morale, discipline, and shock tactics. It demonstrated that small, elite forces could act as force multipliers, achieving disproportionate effects against numerically superior opponents. This lesson would echo in later centuries, influencing both medieval and early modern military theorists who emphasized the importance of professional, well-trained units over raw manpower. The battle also had symbolic significance. In a world dominated by feudal obligations and hierarchical structures, the ability of a small, cohesive force to challenge overwhelming numbers resonated with cultural narratives of courage, honor, and divine favor. Chroniclers often framed the encounter in moral and heroic terms, portraying the knights as paragons of virtue and martial prowess. Such narratives helped reinforce the social and cultural prestige of the knightly class, strengthening the ideals of chivalry and martial honor that was central to medieval society. From a strategic standpoint, the encounter influenced the planning and conduct of future campaigns. Commanders learned to respect the potential of terrain and elite units, understanding that mass numbers could be mitigated by skillful maneuvering, ambushes, and psychological tactics. Armies increasingly incorporated smaller, highly trained contingents capable of independent action, capable of exploiting weaknesses in larger, unwieldy forces. The battle underscored the importance of reconnaissance, the careful selection of battlegrounds, and the necessity of maintaining cohesion and communication across extensive formations, lessons that would remain relevant in military doctrine for centuries. Casualty figures and exact outcomes remain uncertain, as is often the case with medieval engagements. While the 500 knights were heavily outnumbered, their disciplined formations and strategic use of terrain allowed them to inflict disproportionate losses on the enemy. Some accounts suggest that thousands of the larger army were killed or incapacitated, while others fled the field in disarray. Even when the knights did not secure a decisive battlefield victory, the encounter served as a strategic triumph, demonstrating that a well-led, highly trained force could survive and frustrate a much larger adversary. In the long-term perspective, the battle became a touchstone for military lore and legend. Writers, chroniclers, and later historians emphasized its improbability, framing it as a battle against all logic and a testament to the power of courage, skill, and leadership. It served as a benchmark against which other improbable military feats were measured and became part of a broader cultural memory that celebrated the extraordinary potential of small, elite forces to achieve the seemingly impossible. Finally, the battle's legacy continues in lessons that extend beyond military strategy. It illustrates principles of leadership under pressure, the importance of preparation and training, and the psychological dimensions of competition and conflict. For historians, military theorists, and strategists, the 1177 encounter remains a vivid example of how intelligence, ingenuity, and discipline can overcome overwhelming odds. Its story reminds us that in both war and life, size and quantity are not always decisive. Skill, coordination, and courage can rewrite expectations. In conclusion, the aftermath and legacy of the 1177 battle are as remarkable as the battle itself. The immediate consequences reshaped political and military landscapes, while the broader historical lessons have echoed across centuries. The 500 knights, through discipline, strategy, and sheer audacity, demonstrated the extraordinary potential of elite forces, leaving a mark on history that continues to inspire awe. Meanwhile, the 26,000-strong army, despite its numerical advantage, highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in large, complex organizations. Together, they produced a confrontation that defied logic, reshaped military thought, and became a lasting testament to the unpredictable drama of warfare.